this announcement, NASA knew the pressure was on. From May of 1961, three things started happening. First, NASA had to decide which plan they were going to use to get to the moon, and they also needed to start preparing a budget for this plan. The third thing was that Congress had to discuss among themselves and agree how much money to award NASA. To make matters worse, NASA knew absolutely nothing about the moon at the time. They hadn't even been able to send any craft to the moon, and had only barely succeeded in sending the first man into space just a few weeks before. Basically, all their plans for sending a man to the moon were based purely on science fiction. From 1961, the discussion going on was between which one of three options they had for reaching the moon. The first was to send one super big and super heavy rocket on a direct course to the moon without a need to refuel. This super big and heavy craft was known as the Nova. But this approach seemed highly unlikely. The rocket which had carried Alan Shepard up into space on May 5th of 1961 was already much bigger than anything they had ever built. And that one didn't even go into Earth orbit. Earth orbit was not achieved until February 20th of 1962. And since they were having so much trouble just reaching Earth orbit with one rocket, imagine how big one rocket would need to be in order to carry a man all the way to the moon. So then the choice came down between the other two options. One was to create von Braun's space station and send up a heavy craft there to refuel, and the third was this so-called Lunar Orbit Rendezvous program. The Lunar Orbit Rendezvous plan had been proposed several years earlier by John Hobart, but very few people believed in it. The size of the ship was just too small to offer any protection from the radiation. This was basically a let's fake it type of plan. Starting at the beginning of 1962, a huge series of debates and discussions began as as to whether they were going to proceed with von Braun's practical space station plan or to go ahead and fake it with the lunar orbit rendezvous plan. After 6 months of debate and infighting, Wernher von Braun finally caved in. On June 7, 1962, von Braun stood up in a meeting and read from a prepared note announcing that he was officially accepting the lunar orbit rendezvous plan. He was probably not very happy about this decision, but he felt that at least it might be possible to send unmanned crafts to the moon by using this approach, because trying to build a giant ship and a giant space station was certainly not going to happen by the end of the decade. After von Braun signed over to the lunar orbit rendezvous plan on June 7, 1962, it was only a matter of about a month before everyone else was in agreement that this was the approach they were going to take, and a final budget was submitted. On July 1, 1962, Congress met and started discussing the appropriations for NASA's budget on the fiscal year beginning in 1963. Congress finally reached a decision and awarded NASA with a $3.7 billion budget on September 25th. One of the first things NASA did was to start producing this animated video showing what the Lunar Orbit Rendezvous program would look like. Despite the fact that this fake Lunar Orbit Rendezvous program had already been set into motion, it was not entirely too late to stop it. There was still one obstacle in the way, and that was Kennedy. Kennedy would never have allowed them to go on if he knew that they were going to fake it. Kennedy was putting huge pressure on them to make putting a man on the moon as the top priority. In this very interesting video, there is a heated debate between Kennedy and James Webb, where James Webb is trying to appeal to Kennedy about other space priorities and how little they knew about the moon.
You put this program, I think this program is the top priority program of the agency.
No, sir, I do not. I think it is one of the top priority programs, but I think it's very important to recognize here that as you have found what you could do with the rocket, as you found how you could get out beyond the Earth's atmosphere and into space and make measurements, several scientific disciplines that are very powerful have begun to converge on this area.
Jim, I think it is the top priority. I think we ought to have that very clear. Some of these other programs can slip 6 months or 9 months and nothing particularly is going to happen. But this is important for political reasons, international political reasons, and for this is, whether we like it or not, it tends to raise. If we get second to the moon, it's nice, but it's like being second any time. So that if we're second by 6 months, because we didn't give it the kind of priority, then of course that would be very serious. So I think we have to take the view this is the top priority.
Number one, there are real unknowns as to whether man can live under the weightless condition and you will ever make the lunar landing. This is one kind of political vulnerability I'd like to avoid such a flat commitment to.
I agree that we're interested in this, but we can wait 6 months.
But you have to use that information to do your thing.
Yeah, but only when that information directly applies to the program. Jim, I think we got to have that.
Mr. President.
We don't know a damn thing about the surface of the moon, and we're making the wildest guesses about how we're going to land on the moon. And we could get a terrible disaster from putting something down on the surface of the moon that's very different than we think it is. And the scientific programs that find us that information have to have the highest priority, but they are associated with the lunar program. The scientific programs that aren't associated with the lunar program can have any priority we please to give them.
Now, the other thing is, I would certainly not favor spending $6 to $7 billion to find out about space. Why are we spending $7 billion and getting fresh water from salt water when we're spending $7 billion to find out about space? So obviously you wouldn't put it on that priority except for the defense implications. And the second point is the fact that the Soviet Union has made this this a test of the system. So that's why we're doing it. So I think we've got to take the view that this is the key program, and the rest of it's not so that we can find out about it, but there's a lot of things we want to find out about.
But you see,
Cancer and everything else.
when you talk about this, it's very hard to draw a line between what
I
did
think
Russians.
everything that we do ought to really be tied into getting onto the moon and ahead of the Russians.
Why can't it be tied to preeminence in space, which are your own words?
Because by God, we've been telling everybody we're preeminent in space. For 5 years, nobody believes it because they have the booster and the satellite. But I do think we ought to get it, really clear that the policy ought to be that this is the top priority program of the agency and one of the two, except for defense, the top priority of the United States government. I think that's the position we ought to take. Now, this may not change anything about that schedule, but at least we ought to be clear. Otherwise, we shouldn't be spending this kind of money because I'm not that interested in space. I think it's good. I think we ought to know about it. We're ready to spend reasonable amounts of money, but we're talking about fantastic expenditures which wreck our budget and all these other domestic programs. And the only justification for it, in my opinion, to do it is because we hope to beat them, to demonstrate that starting behind it we did by a couple of years. By God, we passed them.
And Kennedy giving them sharp replies about fantastic expenditures which wreck the budget, so they had better make putting a man on the moon as the #1 priority. Now, we are not implying here that NASA's space program had anything to do with Kennedy's assassination.
Через полгода к запуску была готова следующая ракета Н-1. Мишин, ставший главным конструктором вместо Королева, принимает решение об облете Луны. Баллистики рассчитали время пуска — 3 июля, 23 часа 18 минут. Все ждали чуда. Старт прошел точно. Но на высоте 200 метров снова отключились двигатели, и ракета плашмя упала на площадку старта вместе с 2500 тоннами керосина и кислорода. Мощность взрыва составила 5000 тонн в тротиловом эквиваленте. Стартовая позиция была полностью разрушена.